tonight. Julian Della Puppa is an archivist and public historian and a USC alumni with a master's degree in management, library, and information science. He has worked at the USC Shoah Foundation as a metadata archivist, assisting in preserving Holocaust and other historic genocide materials for use in education. He currently works at the Drum Barracks Civil War Museum, where he assists in teaching the public about California's role in the Civil War as a living historian and guide. He currently serves as Vice President of the African Americans in the Civil War Era Roundtable, which is a national roundtable, and where our own Nick Smith is also active. He is also part of the 97th U.S. Colored Troops Living History Group and regularly participates in events that allow him to speak about the contributions and lives of African American soldiers during the Civil War. And he's going to expand that time period for us tonight. Julian, welcome.
Set my water down there, and I apologize if I don't take a sip every now and then, just to help me clear my throat. As stated, my name is Julian Della Puppa, and I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk about the story of black soldiers throughout American history. I'd also like to thank the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable for allowing me to come this evening and to share this very incredible story with you all. Before I begin, just a few things I'd like to mention. We're going to be covering a very vast period of American history. We're starting from the American Revolution and then ending around World War II. So that's kind of the way that I'm encapsulating this presentation. Obviously, I cannot and do not have the ability to speak about every regiment, or every act of heroism, or every individual, but know that those stories do deserve to be heard and told, and I encourage you after this presentation to go and do some searching as well. So if there's some things maybe I haven't mentioned, it'd be great to look more of those things up. I'm just going to be giving you sort of a highlight of these various groups and these various men. And I hope it'll be very interesting and enlightening as well, because the story of many of these soldiers is one of a two-front war. You're dealing with individuals who not only are dealing with the trauma of combat and seeing war from that perspective on the American side, but then they're also dealing with the very intense difficulties, right, that come along with serving either in an army that is fully segregated or in a nation that still contains slavery. So these individuals are dealing with dehumanization and forms of oppression that are coming from, let's say, the home front, while also attempting to do their duty on the front lines. So, with that being said, let us begin. As I said, we're going to start with the American Revolution, which I'm sure we're all very, very familiar with. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about just service of African Americans and black soldiers in general during the American Revolution. Over the course of the war, about 5,000 to 8,000 black men served in the Continental Army. On the other side, which is the British, you'd have about 20,000 or so that would have served. Now, those numbers are incredibly different, and I think that's very important to kind of hone in on. The reason for that is because of Lord Dunmore's declaration, which started in around 1775. He was the last sort of loyalist colonial governor of Virginia at the time. And the reason why he had pushed forth this declaration was so that way he could economically cause damage to the American colonies. His declaration basically said, if you were enslaved, you should run away from your plantation or whoever owned you and make your way to British lines. If you make your way to British lines, you will then become free, but also you should join up in the British Army, and then you would join what they would call the Ethiopian Regiment, where you might be put into another regiment that would have similar individuals as well. Some of those men would see combat against American loyalists, and some of them would be sent across to the Caribbean as well. But as you can see here, the key element is that individuals are running away to obtain their freedom, and then using military service as their vehicle, if you will, to achieve that freedom and then to achieve the status of becoming, right, no longer a slave and being seen as a human being. Of course, the Americans would also respond, and originally there were integrated units in the Continental Army as a whole. Going as far back as some of the Boston, Massachusetts regiments, there were black individuals, usually free people of color, who served in those regiments. They had joined Washington and fought with him as well. But the creation of a specifically all-black regiment really wouldn't come into play up until about 1778. I also wanted to make a small little addendum here as well. Joining and entering the Continental Service was different from the British one from the sense that while the British provided you freedom with your military service, the Continental Army did not agree to that freedom necessarily. If you were joined, and if you were one of these 5,000 to 8,000 men, you may be free at the end of the American Revolution, but that was not a given. Some men were rewarded with freedom for fighting with General Washington. Others, the record doesn't necessarily say. So maybe they achieved their freedom later, or perhaps maybe it wasn't given at all. Another point I should make as well, service in the Continental Army, if you were an enslaved person, was originally illegal. They didn't want any slaves to join up in the army for, well, very obvious reasons, right? That those individuals were considered property to those owners at the time. The only exceptions that would be made would come after 1776 or so, pushing into 1777, and that was because of the manpower situation that was going on. So it is because of that that we started to see more individuals signing up and joining General Washington's army. And that's what leads us to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. There were discussions about forming this regiment just after Valley Forge, and this is because the men who were a part of just a regular Rhode Island Regiment were suffering heavy casualties. And they had seen service with other black individuals who had served with them and thought, hey, we could actually probably recruit more individuals for our cause, so maybe we should go ahead and do that. Well, that's what they would do. However, we do have to keep in mind that by July 10th of 1775, the Continental Congress had put a stop on allowing African Americans to join the Continental Army because of the issue of runaways joining the force itself. Now, as I mentioned, 1776, 77 rolls around, and Washington is looking for more men. So Congress relents, Washington relents, and that's how we end up with the creation of this particular regiment, which officially is mustered into service in around 1778. Now, the reason why they call it the Black Regiment is because there is a specific segregated sub-regiment that is, I guess, maybe more of a company, if you will, inside the 1st Rhode Island Regiment as a whole that was made up of all black troops. Now, from my readings and these historical texts that I pulled from, they had said that the segregation aspect of it wasn't, I guess, negative, as you would see later on in things like World War II, right, where you can't have black and white soldiers serving at the same time. They did it because they wanted to show the prowess of African Americans in combat, and by having an all-black unit, and, seeing it do great feats on the battlefield, as I guess their own way of saying, look at how good these men are in combat. Now, another point I should make about the 1st Rhode Island, it wasn't just an all-black regiment. There were white troops, there were also Native American troops, and there were also mixed-race troops as well. That was part of the regulations, if you will, of the creation of the regiment proper. So once it was made, it had a mix of all of these individuals, but then in particular, it had this one subgroup that was made up of all black soldiers. So let's talk about, well, I always have to have a little quote here, this is fun. So this is a quote taken from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Remember, it says, "It was in driving back these furious attacks that our black regiment distinguished itself with deeds of great valor." And I think that's very true, because that's in the case of the Battle of Rhode Island. Now, I mentioned that the regiment was formed in 1778, and it was in February of that year. A bit later, in August of 1778, they were activated and sent into the siege of what is Newport, and that's how we ended up with the Battle of Rhode Island. The quick and dirty of the battle is that the Continentals had surrounded the city, but due to British reinforcements and the fact that there were, I think, a British naval contingent that was there, they bombarded the Americans, which caused the Continentals to flee. In the process of no longer besieging the city, the 1st Rhode Island was given the task of performing a rearguard action. Now, for those that are not astute in military history, rearguard actions are some of the most difficult forms of combat that one can perform, particularly in, well, the 18th century, the horse and musket era. Right? So their goal is to act as a small party to defend as the Continentals leave the field. And that's essentially what they did. And they would hold off about 3,000 or so Hessian mercenaries in the process of doing so. And that's where that, quote comes in, right? They're fighting very ferociously. they're firing off volleys, eventually it gets into close with hand-to-hand combat, and at some point the regiment, well, it can no longer withstand the great tenacity that is the Hessian mercenaries. But to be fair, when you have 3,000 very angry northern German men coming at you, I think it can also be very difficult to hold the line as well. So they do their duty, and they do it rather well, and they hold off, and they allow the Continental Army at the time to retreat and do so. Of course, this is not the end of 1st Rhode Island. They would continue on throughout the American Revolution, and then would join General Washington at the very famous Battle of Yorktown, right? The pivotal battle that would end the American Revolution, right? Give us victory, if you will. So they were part of the siege that was there as well. So their service is there. Now, something that I do want to point out about this is, while it's great and wonderful that they were able to achieve all of these things on the battlefield, the one thing that is always nipping at their heels, if you will, is this idea of cowardice. Because we have to understand that when we are talking about black troops, from basically the entire period of what I'm going to discuss, there is this constant and persistent notion that black people, African Americans, right, they cannot withstand the traumas of war. They may not understand how to follow orders or shoulder muskets. All of these things, right, are very unfortunately racist concepts and bigoted ideas that existed in the era, right? And part of that is because slavery existed in America at the time, right? Even if you were a free black person, you were not considered a person, so you didn't have a vote, you couldn't participate, right, in elections and things like that. And that extended within itself in the Army. So even the soldiers themselves, and even with the creation of this, right, there was always doubt about whether you could rely on African Americans in combat. The 1st Rhode Island, and of course other free people of color, showed that they very much could do that, and they could see the elephant, if you will, as we will see much later on. So always do keep that in mind. There's an element that is constantly there for them. I think something else that's also very incredible is the fact that you would have individuals who would be enslaved and would have been secured their freedom had they joined the British, but chose to join the American Army instead for many a plethora of different reasons. But I'm sure some of them also could have been that they might have believed in the ideas of the American cause, right? Liberty, right? Justice, right? And equality for all men. And these were all things that were also being discussed even amongst white Continental troops as well, right? How do we equate the idea of equality for all, was we also have slavery that exists as well. And we're going so far as to even have enslaved soldiers fighting for us, because that was the thing that happened as well. You also had men who were enslaved and took the place of their white counterpart. So instead of saying, hey, you're going to be going into George Washington's army, oh no, don't worry, I'll have this man that I own, he will take my place. And the Commons also accepted that as a concept as well. So, all right, now, War of 1812.
Can I ask you a question?
Well, we're going to have questions at the end, okay. so please hold on to that, but thank you. War of 1812. So, War of 1812, pretty much the American Revolution Part 2, as it sort of continues. Service there would have been very, very similar to that of the American Revolution. You would still have some form of integrated units with free people of color also joining those regiments as well. You would also have enslaved people who would have run away, and they would have joined those regiments as well. That was also part of it. The same deal, well, this time it wasn't Lord Dunmore's declaration. There was a similar deal that the British trotted out just like they did in 1775, and a number of individuals also chose to join British ranks as well, and also gained their freedoms. In this case, we have certain places like New York and Pennsylvania, which would have recruited whole black regiments as well. And let's also not forget about the Navy. The Navy has always been an integrated factor that's been part of the American Armed Forces, and about 20% of the naval crews were black at the time. It should also be said that when the whole affair began with the War of 1812 and the impressment of American sailors, that original ship that was captured, 3 of those men were also black as well. So, but they were Americans, right? And this outraged America in general as a whole. Now, I'll point out the gentleman that you see there. That is an artistic rendering of Mr. Frederick Hall, also known as William Williams. He was an enslaved man who lived in Maryland, and he had run away and just only really been out for maybe a couple of weeks or so when he went down to Baltimore and then joined an American volunteer regiment. After that, he was given an early bit of pay and then was sent to Fort William McHenry to defend the fort. Of course, we all know what happens there, right? The British bombard the fort. The Americans hold the line, right, and they aren't necessarily able to capture the port of Baltimore like they're supposed to. It's in the process of that Frederick Hall ends up being wounded. He loses his leg, and then days afterwards he succumbs to his wounds. But I point to you his story because I think it's a very, very interesting one. It's one where when he ran away, he didn't have to go and join up with the American army. He could have, in fact, ran away and made his way up to Canada and lived his life as a free person. But he chose not to. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that he himself did believe in the ideas that America had. But again, because of his status, because of his race, right, he had lived a life that was hard and rather difficult. But he made, I think, a very important sacrifice, right? One, to put himself on the life of the line of a country in which he was enslaved himself. And then he paid the ultimate price. So. Now, we get to this, Major Joseph de Savary. March on, my friends. March on against the enemies of the country. And that is what Major de Savary would say during the Battle of New Orleans. And here we get to the discussion about the 2nd Battalion, Free Men of Color. Now this is a very interesting group because those that would have made up this particular battalion would have been veterans of the Haitian Revolution. If you're not aware of that, definitely look that one up. It's a very, very interesting piece of just global history in general, and in fact how the nation of Haiti came to form itself. It formed itself through the only successful slave rebellion that existed in the time of slavery, at least in the Caribbean, but also, let's just say, the North American regions of that whole area in general. Those individuals that had fought the French and had beaten them on the island of Haiti, they had come to New Orleans, and when the city was under siege, there was need of a defense. And so not only did white individuals sign up for the army and join General Andrew Jackson to beat back the British, a number of black individuals as well signed up for the army and joined General Jackson. And Jackson had 2 companies of black troops. One of them was this one here, the 2nd Battalion, Free Men of Color. Now, the battalion itself was activated in December of 1814 and then would sort of go into action pretty quickly after that. It was made up of around 256 men. And in their first actual taste of combat, it would be just a little bit before the Battle of New Orleans. They would fight off a British sort of raiding party, almost like a skirmish on the banks of the Mississippi. And it would be there that they would show their stuff. Now, during the actual Battle of New Orleans itself, Andrew Jackson did not necessarily deploy his 2 black regiments. He had kept them behind as reserves to then deploy later on when facing the British. However, Savary would not be denied glory. No, this man had fought against the French, and he would certainly see one done to the British. So he himself ran to the sound of the guns and marched his men towards General Andrew Jackson. When he arrived on the battlefield, he assisted in the battle proper, as well as his men, forming them up in line and beating back the British. But it should also be said that it is the 2nd Battalion, Free Men of Color, that end up shooting the top British general that's leading the overall British advance, and end up killing him. Of course, the battle ends, and we all know the Americans take victory, and Andrew Jackson himself would praise de Savary's group for their actions and for assisting the city of New Orleans. Unfortunately, once again, the very sad and terrible head of bigotry has to rear its head again. So while we have this great and wonderful victory in the Battle of New Orleans, the 2 black battalions would not be allowed back into the city of New Orleans. The mayors and the city fathers of New Orleans were very concerned with having armed black men on the streets of New Orleans out of fear of slave uprisings. And this is something to always kind of keep in mind. So while these men had defended the city, some of them even died for it, they would not be allowed to participate in any of the celebrations or the parades that would come with that. Even Jackson praising them and somewhat standing by their side to those that would be in the city, they still did not allow it because of that never-ending gnawing fear, right, of a possible slave insurrection. So Joseph and his men would end up leaving New Orleans after this, and they would make their way to Spanish Texas. And in some historical annals, they say they even assisted the Americans much later on, right, during the Texas Revolution. The last that we do know about de Savary is that he ended up in New Orleans in 1820, but the historical record's a little bit fuzzy there about how he re-entered America or where that would have gone. But incredible that these individuals would rally themselves for the city, beat back the British, and then also they're veterans of fighting 2 massive European colonial empires. They now have victory against the French and victory against the British. So 2 accolades there for the 2nd Battalion, Free Men of Color. All right, U.S.-Mexico War. I think a war we're all very familiar with here in the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable, right? The war before the American Civil War. So service, what we call the Mexican War, for African Americans was very limited. By 1821, the racist laws that were put into place officially said that no more could we have any black individuals serving in the Army. Now, they could always be part of the Navy, because sailing large naval vessels requires vast amounts of manpower, and getting a hold of anyone who can rig a sail, very, very important also, and that history ties all the way back. But in terms of the structure and the way that the Army works, they didn't want that to happen. And again, that is because of the fact that there's always that gnawing feeling, right, of slave insurrection always being there. And also, if you had an integrated force, this would have been very disruptive for sort of the racial mores of the time. What if you had a black individual who was very good at his job, and then he ended up becoming a captain, or let's say a major, right, like Major Savage, which I forgot to point out, he is the first black major in the U.S. Army, and we wouldn't have one until the 1950s, so that would come much later on. So, but what if you had this high-ranking officer? Was he going to go around and point at lower-ranking white troops and tell them what to do? That was completely unacceptable, and no one would not have allowed that at the time. So they were not allowed into the Army. But it doesn't mean that African Americans weren't serving in a military capacity during the U.S.-Mexico War. They always were. It's just that it might have been visible. So we're going to talk a little bit about Mr. Jacob Dodson here. Now, Jacob Dodson was a free person of color who was a known tracker, and I think the key factor I would say about him is that he joined John C. Fremont in his many expeditions, and particularly out here out west for California. It would be in his second expedition that he would be joining Fremont, not as a servant, but as a staff member of the overall party that existed, and he was there in the Battle of Los Angeles and sort of dealing with Mexicans here in California. And of course, there's that famous ride where he has to make his way down to Monterey. Dodson would be a part of that. For his service with John C. Fremont and all that he did for the American cause, he would receive a pension in 1856, which I think is pretty strong, right? Even though he himself would not have been allowed in the Army proper, right? He did serve in this auxiliary capacity and then was recognized by the U.S. government for his role in that, which I think is very interesting. A little addendum to Mr. Dodson is that because of his service with the United States before, just as the American Civil War was going to break out, he had written Congress saying, sirs, I'm prepared to raise a regiment of black soldiers, 300 of them, and when the letter got to Congress, a congressman wrote back to him and very curtly told him, sir, we have no need of colored soldiers at this time. So I guess he was not allowed to do that. However, he did work very hard to get black people into the Army as recruits when it would open up with the United States Colored Troops, which is a group that I'll be talking about here very soon. So, now, Dick Green, this is another very interesting case. Dick Green was an enslaved man to the governor of New Mexico at the time. This was the American governor. Now, in a soldier capacity, it comes into play when that governor is killed by Mexican rebels, right? They're individuals who don't want to be under American control, they don't like the governor, there's a bit of an uprising, he gets killed. A posse is put together, and Dick Green joins that posse and rides out, and they find those that killed the governor. Once they deal with them, Green then joins the rest of that group and the American forces, and they fight the Battle of El Mabuda. And then when that's finished, Green is then freed by the governor's brother, and that includes his wife as well. So I think that's another very interesting point as well, right? The person who owned Dick Green was killed by the rebels. It's very plausible that he could have just run away or disappeared or done something entirely different, but he didn't, right? He still put his life on the line, even though at the time, maybe it wouldn't have made a lot of sense, but he chose to do that anyway. And for his service for that, he ended up obtaining his freedom. So I think as you can see here, based off of a lot of the examples I've given so far, is that many times when African Americans and black troops are entering military service, the goal here consistently, right, is to create a burgeoning civil rights movement. There is this consistent element of service being used as the vehicle to see one's humanity and to view them as a citizen. I'd like to liken this very similar to Rome, right? There's the old Roman concept of service is citizenship. which was very true even at that time, right? You would enter the Roman army, you would be a soldier, you would serve your time, and then you would become a citizen of Rome. And you have all of the rights and powerful things that come along with that. In many ways, you can parallel some of that with African-American soldiers and their service to America in general. But it's also very difficult as well, because as many times that they put their lives on the line, there is still that consistent and very nagging difficulty that some of that service is not necessarily respected, right? Only some of their human rights or their value as a human being is given in increments, right? But it's still, that needle is still being pushed forward, and people still fight and strive for it. And we'll see that as we move along. So, the American Civil War. What can I say? So many things can I say about the American Civil War, but we do not have time for that. But of course, we will sit here and we will discuss the United States Colored Troops, and that's what the acronym stands for, the USCT. Now, the USCT is a very interesting military organization because the bones of this organization have existed, pretty sure as I've shown you, as far back as the American Revolution. African Americans have been serving in most of America's great wars. So of course, in this war that is encompassing the soul of the nation, that is dealing with the issues of union, but of course it's dealing with what? The expansion of slavery in American society. So this is absolutely a war in which you would see African Americans fight them, but it wouldn't be in 1861 when African Americans would join the war proper. And again, that is because of that law, right, the 1821 law, that barred them from entering service, right? It was very difficult. Now, individuals like Frederick Douglass had been talking to Abraham Lincoln and telling him, you know, we need to put us in the fight because this is our fight as well. And of course, others as well. But Lincoln couldn't do that, but he could, and eventually was able to do so because of the Militia Act of 1862, which was passed in July of 1862. Now, that Militia Act allowed African Americans back into military service, at least in the Army, and then with the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation, that sort of further solidified this element. And that's when you start to see the creation of proper federal regiments made up of black troops, right? You think of regiments like, the 54th Massachusetts, right? The film Glory, right? It is because of this Militia Act that these things come into play. However, you'll see here in my next slide, the start of the USCT almost really isn't 1863. It really is almost more 1862 and a little bit before. Part of it is also because we had militia regiments that were raised in the 1850s as a response to the Compromise of 1850, and specifically I'm talking about the Fugitive Slave Act and the things that came along with it, right? The sort of intensification of being able to recapture human beings when they leave the plantation, right? Part of the Fugitive Slave Act basically says that even if you make your way north, you're still not free. Someone could come and gather slave catchers and bring you back in. And even if you're a free person of color, if you have proper documentation, you could be brought right back into slavery, right? So this angered a lot of African American communities that were in the north, and so they formed protection groups, these legalized militias, that were mostly illegal, right? Because they weren't allowed to formulate themselves. So things like the Massasoit Guards, good example, they're based out in Boston. They would have been training and preparing themselves. So even before the American Civil War, to a certain extent, black people were preparing for a war because the war had already come to their doorstep, right? Now, let's get back into the USCT. During the war proper, 170,000 black soldiers sort of served in the Union Army, and they had about 70,000 white officers, and that's over the course of that time. Now, here's another great quote here from Richard Hinton of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, who's the adjutant of them. The men fought like tigers, each and every one of them, and the main difficulty was to hold them well in hand. And that is because of the Battle of Island Mountain. So, this here is the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers. We call it the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. The name kind of slips between the two. But remember how I said that this is, this is before the creation of the USCT in 1863. They're first mustered into service in August of 1862, and then they would end up fighting in the Battle of Island Mound just a little bit after that. Now, it's interesting that we're talking about Kansas, and this is something else to note as well. They're not considered the 1st USCT regiment. They are considered one of the 1st because there's a grand historic debate about who is the 1st. There are a number of black militia regiments or other formalized groups, maybe even informal groups that could have been formed that could claim that they are the first sort of USCT regiment. So this is just one of them. Now, I'm sure you probably know about Bleeding Kansas and all the things that went on with that, like between the pro-slavery forces and the anti-slavery forces out there. So Kansas was always kind of a hotbed for, well, just the discussion between pro and anti-slavery. So in the creation of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there were abolitionist elements that were fueling the creation of this regiment. And that's what ended up happening. We ended up having runaways and free people of color who lived there, and they would sign up and join this regiment before it was even legally created, but it existed. They would end up going to fight in the Battle of Island Mound, which is in Missouri, in the later part of 1862. And that action, I think, is a very interesting one because it was about dealing with Confederate bushwhackers. They say there's about 600 of these guerrillas that were kind of terrorizing Union people and burning farms and things like that. And they hadn't had Union regiments on standby just yet. So they sent out the 1st Kansas. They make their way to Island Mound. They set themselves up in one farm and they start building entrenchments. Those entrenchments are then, well, I guess the fort that it now becomes ends up being called Fort Africa. Now, the Confederate forces know that they've arrived, and at that point, they try a tactic of luring out some of the men from the 1st Kansas. Their strategy is lure out as many as they can, and then they'll sort of surround them and crush them piecemeal. The commander, who's there at Fort Africa, sees that the Confederates started burning fires in some of the local areas, so he sends out a couple contingents to sort of go and investigate. As they leave, the Confederates then attack Fort Africa, thinking, okay, they've left a number of men out in the open, this is our chance. Well, that's where the ferocity of the tigers kick in, because as soon as the Confederates attack, the lead commander on the Union side ends up going down, but he's not killed, but the men think that he's killed, and it enrages them. So after firing some volleys, and they get into hand-to-hand combat, it's very, very brutal, and this goes on for some time. After hearing the gunfire, the other regiments that are on the other side that were dealing with the fires come back in and then defeat Confederate forces, and that puts an end to the Battle of Island Mound. Now, what's so incredible about this is that this victory is spread to the newspapers in the local area, but it goes to show and prove, right, that African Americans are able to hold their ground in war. And that was something that was consistently over not only these men, but over the creation of the USCT in general. I go back to Jacob Dodson, right? They stated they had no need for colored soldiers. And part of that, once again, has to do with the fact, right, that for whatever reason, individuals did not believe that black people could show their arms, fire a gun, march like the rest, that they would run away as soon as they heard the first cannon shot or the first musket shot, right? And that was not true at all. They fought, they stood their ground, and they won the battle. And they would also go on to fight in other battles as well throughout the American Civil War. And there are other regiments who have done the same thing. I point back to the 54th Massachusetts and all the Medal of Honor winners, right, that come out from there. And of course, we can't forget the Battle of New Market Heights as well, where USCT forces performed absolutely admirably, whilst they were rushing headlong into Confederate fire, almost suicidally so, right? But still maintained to hold their ground and eventually breaking through the Confederate defenses that were there at New Market Heights. So, all of that is still there. But, it's very interesting that we see these horrible bigoted opinions pop up time and time again when there's still so much historical evidence, and I think even for those who exist at the time to say, no, look, we've seen this time and time again. So, sad to say, but it'll always be there. Now, the Spanish-American War, I think we all know what's coming next, the Buffalo Soldiers. Very, very famous battle-hardened unit of the American Army. Now, Buffalo Soldiers are a direct legacy unit of the USCT. They are men who would have either been veterans of the American Civil War, and they would have been formed in 1866 properly. And that was their act of Congress. And as it says here, right, the 9th and the 10th Cavalry, the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st regiments were all created in 1866. Right, and these were made up of former USCT veterans. They would have garrisoned the South in different positions, and eventually they would have been sent out west. By 1869, they would form, what we more formally know as the Buffalo Soldiers, which is the 9th Cavalry, 10th Cavalry, 24th, and 25th Infantry Regiments. Right, all of those together would end up being the Buffalo Soldiers that we now sort of know. And that photo there is taken in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. I believe that's the 24th Infantry that's there. Now, what's I think is very interesting about the Buffalo Soldiers is that, of course, they fight in the Indian Wars in the 1870s and the 1880s, but a lot of the reason for that is because, again, while this time there's no longer fear of slave insurrection, right, because slavery is now over, we won the American Civil War, there are still many individuals, though, who do not like the idea of a black man in a uniform carrying a gun and also telling you what to do. And now they have the backing of the federal government to tell you what to do if you step out of line. So, because of that, it was, let's say, more judicious for areas in the South and in other areas to put black troops in the West, where they can then handle and deal with, right, sort of the colonial settling of the West and dealing with the Native American tribes that are there and the battles that would come with. And they, of course, would gain much glory in the 1870s and 80s for fighting the Indian Wars. Now, in the 1890s, the West is closed. America has done its experiment, right? The Wild West is over. We've settled everything. And that's what leads us into, well, the Spanish-American War. Now, this is a fun quote by Rough Rider Frank Knox. "I never saw braver men anywhere." And that's him quoting it after the Battle of what? The San Juan Hill, right? Very famous battle. One that Theodore Roosevelt would talk very highly of. And as much as I enjoy Roosevelt, let's not forget, he brought a whole journalist with him during the campaign in Cuba. So of course he's going to talk about it all the time. I think he's one of America's great propagandists in that way. He very much knew how to sell himself in that way. So, when talking about the Buffalo Soldiers, at least in Cuba, I think this is a very interesting one because they are now no longer fighting or dealing with Native Americans, but now they're fighting a proper European army, the Spanish, who are well-trained and relatively well-led and also well-armed and equipped. And they also come as veterans of previous wars, which makes them, what? Well, crack troops for the American Army. You have to remember that after the American Civil War, the American Army was reduced. There was no need for hundreds of thousands of troops, right, and all these weapons and arms and material. So we went back to being what the American Army always was, a frontier fighting police force. Right? So when the war with Spain breaks out, what happens? We need more men. So we go back to the old Civil War system, and we rely on mass numbers of volunteers. But who are the core basis of federal forces? Well, you're going to want to have the 24th, 25th, right, infantry regiments, and the 9th and the 10th cavalry. All of them would be sent effectively to Cuba to do so. Now, when it comes to the Battle of the San Juan Hill, I think this is very interesting because Theodore Roosevelt claims that he's the big winner of the battle, but really it was a combination of American units at San Juan that ended up achieving victory, and a good portion of those units were what? Buffalo Soldiers. There you had elements of the 9th and 10th, and I believe the 24th was also there. They were stationed with Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. So for the Battle of the San Juan Hill, what you have is the Buffalo Soldiers arrive with Theodore Roosevelt. They're at the heights and they're just sort of marshaling there, getting ready to prepare for the attack. The Spanish had already sighted them and began pouring rifle fire as close as they could to them. You have to remember they're using Mauser rifles, which are very accurate, very long range. The Americans still using trapdoor Springfields. In the case of the Buffalo Soldiers, they were a bit better. They were given, I think, Craghorns and carbines, so something that was a little more akin to the Mauser, but still, the Spanish have the upper advantage. So as they're surrounding the heights, preparing to get ready, a number of men start falling, and it's in that point that we end up seeing one private of the Buffalo Soldiers, Private Marshall, sees another private, Private Baker, get hit. He falls down into the river that's close to them. As he's sort of struggling and in pain, Marshall is told not to go and save his comrade. He disobeys orders, and as bullets are whizzing past him, he ends up picking that man up, taking him back to the rear to go and see a doctor, and then he joins the advance with the 10th Cavalry as they make their way up the hill. Now, how does the battle sort of go for the Buffalo Soldiers? I think rather well, although rather difficult, right? They're attacking San Juan Hill, they're also attacking Kettle Hill. It is in that moment where Theodore Roosevelt and elements of the 9th, I believe, are making their way up Kettle Hill, and they fight and they defeat the Spanish. It's there that Roosevelt would do sort of a rallying cry and then try his, make his way down the other way to assist the other Buffalo Soldiers. Only 5 men come with him, so he has to run back and then get more men so then he can continue the attack proper. Right? Eventually, with a combination of the Buffalo Soldiers and the Rough Riders, they also manage to take San Juan and Kettle Hill. They plant the flags at the top, and that's the end of the battle. right? And it's because of that that we end up with pretty much the end of the Spanish-American War in Cuba, right? The opening up of San Juan gives the Americans access to the capital, which brings the Spanish to the negotiating table, right? After the battle, the Buffalo Soldiers would be praised. So of course we have that quote from before, right? Never seen braver men anywhere. Even Theodore Roosevelt himself would end up praising Buffalo Soldiers for their amazing work that they did at the Battle of the San Juan Hill. Unfortunately, right, as well as these men did, they would still have to deal with negative things said about them. While this time, it's nothing different. It's that same thing about them being cowards. And in this case, it comes from Theodore Roosevelt himself. Some years later, after the battle, right, he changes his opinion, and he quotes, and he says that the troops were shirkers in their duties and would only go as far as they were led by white officers, which was not true. He even praised them after the battle, and he was there himself. But for whatever reason, he chose to make that statement. In response to that, a trooper with the Ninth Cavalry would respond to Theodore Roosevelt in a newspaper and would rebuff that claim and would say that it is because of our work that we did in the battles of Las Guasimas as well that we raised morale, right, and we assisted in the victory. And that what you said was and he used the word uncharitable and ungrateful, which I think is very true, right? They were there just like the Rough Riders were, and they did a damn good job just like them, right? No reason to say that they were cowards or shirkers or needed to be led by extra white officers, right? These men were veterans of wars, right? Multiple wars that they had fought themselves, and they were considered good crack troops for the U.S. Army, right? But the color of their skin, right, I guess deems them open and available for disparagement for whatever reason. So, very unfortunate. But they're still victorious. Last thing I will leave you with about this, and I think it's an interesting one when I was looking this up about the Buffalo Soldiers, their heroism overall, right, about the course of the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War, it's very uplifting for those that live in the black community. There are many poems and stories and prints and pieces of artworks that were written about them because they were elevated and seen as heroes at a time in which there weren't necessarily many heroes, although that's very arguable because there were many black heroes even before. So, but based on information and all that, but it's still very interesting nevertheless. All right, World War I. Very difficult time for the world. Now this is from a Prussian officer captured in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. They say, "They are devils. They smile while they kill, and they won't be taken alive." Now, I find that to be very, very high praise coming from a Prussian officer during the Meuse-Argonne, because if you know anything about the German army during the First World War, it did a very, very good job of trying to hold off the Allied powers as long as they could, but ultimately were not successful. And I think if any enemy in combat can be scared of you, I think that goes to show you the power of your regiment and what you're able to do. And that was the case of the 369th Infantry Regiment, also known as the Harlem Hellfighters, which was the name that the Germans gave them. They preferred to be called the Black Rattlers because the patch on their arm that they had was an insignia of a rattlesnake. And then if you were French, you would have called these men Léon Bronze, or the Men of Bronze, right? Which I think is a very, it's a very French thing to say, sort of a combination of art and glory all in one, right? These bronze men of statue going off to war in their way. But in many ways, that's who the 369th were. These were hard-fighting individuals who really did not let up. It's just very, very sorry that they weren't under American command for the entirety of the war. And we'll get into that. When the regiment was formed, it was originally formed sometime in 1917. It would be the first New York National Guard regiment. That's not what it was. There was the 15th New York National Guard regiment, but it was the first all-black National Guard regiment that New York had at the time. They would be one of two combat regiments that were fought in the First World War, at least all-black combat regiments there. The other one is the 92nd Infantry. A little spoiler here for you. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later, but not during the World War I service, but they were one of the two that were there. When they ended up being created, and just before they were being sent off to France, they were a group that was formed specifically to fight. That's what they wanted to do. And when they were receiving new recruits originally, they had some of the best help you could possibly want. They had band member James Reese Europe, who was a very famous band leader at the time. He was a ragtime band leader, and he would have these big parties in New York City to try and get as many men as possible to join the regiment, and it worked. Many definitely signed on because of James Reese Europe's music and his ability to really sell the regiment. They would eventually end up in France, and when they would land, they wanted to fight. Their sort of like leaders, like the colonel of the regiment himself, he had petitioned Pershing to send them into the fight because they weren't going to be sitting around being stevedores or building entrenchments. He knew that he needed to get his men into combat. Pershing himself didn't want to send these men into combat. He wanted to send his other regiments in first. So what did he do? He said, well, let's just give them to the French. The French need more men. So they would be some of the first American troops to see combat in France. They would join up with the French army, and the reason for this is because it was, at least at the time, they said that the French were very good at handling black troops, and that's because of the fact that they had a large colonial empire in Africa. You have to remember that the French were fighting the Germans and the Austrians with the Tirailleurs Senegalais, right, which are the Senegalese troops, and they had been there since about 1914-15. So they had been given to the Germans for some time now. So they thought, hey, those are black troops, let's get the American black troops set up, we'll get those two units together and we'll have them trained together with French equipment. Now, that's the thing. They weren't given French uniforms, they were given, well, they kept their American uniforms, and then they were given French helmets, weapons, accoutrements, and even wine, which they loved, by the way, because they were not allowed to have that in the American army, so that was part of the arrangement. Now, they would end up formally, on the line itself in 1918, and they would fight during the Meuse-Argonne, which was one of the largest offensives during the First World War, and that was very, very hard fighting. The regiment itself would end up spending time, 191 days in combat, which was very long for any World War I regiment at the time. And throughout that, they would take 1,500 casualties and about 900 replacements. So these guys were getting hit really hard, and they couldn't even build back up to actual combat strength with that. And on top of it, they ended up entering French service, which they really liked, because compared to American service, there was a sense of dignity and respect that the French gave to them, right? Again, you have to remember that the Americans went to the First World War still living in the Jim Crow era, and they were dealing with a segregated army. So even the commands and the things that the men were dealing with, even back when they were at home, right, they were still dealing with racism and segregation. But once they entered French lines, things were a little bit different. Tend to shake your hand, treat you like a human being. The French just had a very different way of, I guess, dealing with people, and they really did enjoy that. But let's talk a little bit about the heroism that's here. I'd like to talk about Mr. Henry Johnson, who is a Medal of Honor winner. Now, Henry Johnson, at least in one of these nights during the Meuse-Argonne, it's about 2 a.m. Of course, he's in the French sector. He has to defend an entrenchment line. He hears rustling that's going on out in no man's land, and then sees, well, a German helmet. It's at that point that he grabs his rifle and also alerts his comrade that's with him, and they start firing, and there's a firefight that goes on between him and the Germans. Now, it should be pointed out that they didn't know how many men were there, but sources say that in the course of the firing, more Germans come, and it's maybe 12 to 20 Germans against 2 men. Well, the Germans, I think, kind of realize that they might have the upper hand, so they start to rush the position. Eventually, the ammunition runs out, and what happens? Well, Johnson has to take out a bolo knife. He notices that his comrade is about to be taken by the Germans, so he intervenes by throwing some grenades. Then he gets into hand-to-hand combat with the Germans, stabs a man in the head, beats another man with the butt of a rifle. There's still more of this very violent pell-mell that's going on. Eventually, they hear French voices in the background, and that's French reinforcements coming, and that's kind of what signals the end of the German attack, and they end up running away. What we do know is that Johnson probably killed about 6 men, and in total, we don't really know how many were wounded, but if it's an attack of 12 to 20, he either did 50% casualties or he did something close to it, which is pretty good. So for one man to fight anywhere between 12 to 20 men, I mean, that's some Sergeant York quality stuff right there. I mean, that's very, very strong. And he would be rewarded with the Croix de Guerre by the French for his actions that night during the Meuse-Argonne. It is very unfortunate that the Americans gave him nothing when the war was over, and the best that they could provide for him was maybe a military pension. He died penniless years later. However, He would receive the Medal of Honor in 2015, posthumously, and I think very deservedly so, for his actions that night in those French trenches. So, coming down to the close here, World War II, the world engulfed by great fire. So, Captain John D. Long of B Company, 761st Tank Battalion, he says, "Not for God and country, but for me and my people." And this quote really, really resonated with me. And I think the reason for that has to do with the fact that Captain Long is not just talking about service, but he's talking about the ideas of double victory. Victory at home and victory abroad. Because at the time of World War II, we have to remember that we fought Hitler with a segregated army. While he was pushing Jewish people into gas chambers, enacting racial laws, ensuring that their families were broken apart, in America, black people were under Jim Crow. And they had, they didn't have the same rights as white people. Right? And in many ways, if we're going to do a bit of a comparison between the two, many of the racial laws that Jewish people faced in Germany were based off of Jim Crow era laws that were created by the United States. So Hitler used those as a blueprint. And that was not lost on African American veterans of the Second World War. They knew that very thoroughly. So I think in this quote, why it's so strong for me is because when he is fighting, he knows that he's fighting for himself and for those back at home. And that if he dies and the glory that he might achieve, hopefully that can be used as a catalyst, right, to push forward that needle of civil rights. Now, let's talk about 761st Tank Battalion. I really enjoy this military unit. It's a hard, crack unit that was part of General Patton's army when fighting through France. These men would have landed on the beaches of Omaha during D-Day as part of the Sherman Tank Battalion that was there. Now, they were formed in around 1942. There were other black armored regiments that existed as well in the American Army. We do not have time to talk about all of them, but this one in particular would have been slated to go and fight in France. Now, over the course of their time in the war, they would end up fighting in the Sarre Basin, the Battle of Morville in France, the Battle of the Bulge, of course the breakthrough of the Siegfried Line, right, and Task Force Rhine in Germany. But all very pivotal moments of the Second World War, at least for the European operating theater, right, that was going on at the time. As a group in general, they would have received 391 battle awards, which is pretty good. Overall, there's not too much I can say about their military prowess and accolades because it really stands for itself. But before we get into at least one little incident of heroism, we'll talk a little bit about their training as well. When they were first started off training in 1942, even the ideas of creating a black tank unit was sort of dismissed. It's in the same vein as, could we even have black pilots, right? And then we end up with the Tuskegee Airmen, and they do an amazing job, and it's a very similar story in that vein. I'll also bring this one up too. In the process of their training, they also had one very famous individual who was a part of this group, and his name was Jackie Robinson. I don't think he needs any introduction. I'm not going to say too much about him. You all know who Mr. Jackie Robinson is. Robinson had joined the tank group, and he was prepared to, go in for training. And when he got on that U.S. Army bus, they told him to go to the back of the bus. Jackie Robinson was not going to go to the back of the bus. And Jackie Robinson did not go to the back of the bus. He didn't. However, that was illegal at the time. And once High Command found out that Jackie Robinson had disobeyed orders, they wanted to court-martial him. The man that was in command of the 761st tried to shield some of that, but the U.S. Army is very good about shuffling individuals, so they shuffled Robinson from the 761st to a different battalion and then court-martialed him. And unfortunately, he was not able to join the 761st to fight in Europe, but he would still end up being in the Army. But after serving some time, obviously, for disobeying orders and the racist law of telling him to go sit in the back of the bus. So, now, let's get into combat. So, the 761st Tank Battalion really sees their test of fire, if you will, in Morville, France. And their job at the time is to assist the 26th Infantry Regiment. Their goal is to enter the town and secure it, and this is as the infantry is moving in. And if you know anything about World War II tactics, tanks always support infantry no matter where they are. So, the day of the battle, there are no white officers present. They were elsewhere, so it was up to Captain Long to send his men forward. In the process of entering the first part of the town, a German rocket launcher, known as a Panzerfaust, hits the first tank, and this is the lead tank of a Sergeant King. King notices this, jumps out with the rest of his men, and they surround that first tank, pull out the men from the burning wreckage, and then commence to find, well, the German Panzerfaust shooter. He gets killed along with an anti-tank gun that's located in the town. They then get back in their tanks, keep it pushing. It's said a little bit later on after that first day when they capture a German soldier, he likens them to fighting Russian tank crews, which, if you don't know, it's very high praise for a Nazi soldier. And the reason for that is because the war on the Eastern Front is incredibly brutal. It's some of the hardest fighting in World War II, and part of that is because there's an intense hatred between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. This combination of ideologies goes hand in hand, so there's no quarter combat that goes on in the East. So for this soldier to look at these black troops who have never seen combat before and say to them, you fight like the Russians, I think it's pretty powerful stuff. And they would go on to do so. A day or so later, as they're making their way through some obstacles, assisting the 26th, the tank in front of, I believe his name is Sergeant Roy Rubin, his tank has some sort of obstruction in front of it. I think it's like trees. Germans are pouring down fire onto the tank column, and instead of just sitting in his tank and firing back, he hops out of the tank, removes the obstacle while taking machine gun fire, basically kicks the stuff out of the way, gets back inside of the tank itself, then, I guess, gets some ammunition, pops open on the 50, silences that machine gun, and then silences the anti-tank gun that's also shooting at them, which allows the rest of the column to go through, right? There are other moments like this that happen as well about the battles in France, but they do the job that they need to do, and they do it well. And of course, I think 391 battle awards, I think, signals and shows you how well of a tank battalion they were. The last thing I will point out is they are also along with some American units that end up liberating I believe it's the Munchausen subsection concentration camp. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry for getting that wrong. But just know that they were assisting in the liberation of one of the concentration camps that was there, at least in Germany at the time, which I also think is very interesting. All right, the last group I will talk about is one of my beloveds, the 92nd Infantry Division. And they would fight in World War II, particularly participating in the battles of the Gothic Line and the Stecchio Valley, and then would end up entering Genoa in 1945. Well, would fight in and around Genoa and then would end the war there in 1945. Part of the reason for that is also because I'm half Italian myself, so it's very interesting to see individuals being involved in combat over there. Now, the story of the 92nd is very much a fraught one. If you do research on them after this, I do want to point out that the reason for that is because of their combat record, right? While their formation goes back to 1917 and the soldiers that would fight in the First World War, those that would end up being created for fighting in Italy would be around 1943. Now, when we want to talk about them and the struggles that they had, it really does go back to the formation of their unit, and that's because of where they were in Fort Huachuca, which was in Arizona. When they formed this unit, which by the way, this is also a legacy Buffalo Soldiers unit, and their patch was a buffalo, so they actually called themselves the Buffalo Soldiers. When they went out to Arizona to do their training, there was not enough space for them, so a number of the regiment ended up being spread out across various bases, which doesn't lead to good morale or combat fighting or cohesion. And the reason for that is because they couldn't stay in military bases that were closer to the south, right, because of racism, and specifically because they didn't want to have to deal, right, with that type of racism. So they sent them out to Arizona. That was not very helpful. Then on top of that, the U.S. Army believed that Southerners would make the best type of officer for an all-black infantry unit. Okay, so you see where I'm going with this. Yeah. So that was not very helpful because those men did not treat those men very well and didn't believe in their combat abilities, which would become a real problem for them when they made their way to Italy, right? So when they finally entered the Italian front in 1943, and then more like 44, and they started fighting in the Gothic Line, there's struggles. The 92nd is struggling, just like other Allied units are struggling to defeat the Germans and the Italians. And they're getting it now from both sides. They're getting it from high command, who doesn't necessarily believe in them and their officers, right? And then, of course, they're getting it from the Germans, where if you don't know much about fighting in Italy, keep in mind Kesselring, the German commander at the time, even the forces that are there, those are all veteran German units. They'd all been fighting on the east. Hitler had put some of the best men to hold and defend Italy, and Italy is a defender's dream. Mountains, hills, streams, swaths. I mean, it's nasty stuff. And it's hard enough for white soldiers to go through with it. But now you have these black troops put on a relatively active part of the line to do their duty, and they're struggling to get through it, right? But they still manage to do so. Even though they're dealing with these hardships, they still manage to persevere, and they still manage to fight on. And that's what leads me to talk about Medal of Honor winner Vernon Baker, right? Vernon Baker would end up receiving his Medal of Honor in 1945. Not officially then, his would actually come in 1997, much later on, because he would only be given a Distinguished Service Cross for his efforts. But in 45, he has to take what's known as Castle Angolfini. And the thing is, no one had taken that castle. No one. White, black, didn't matter. No one had taken it because it was a well-structured defensive fortification, right? Baker, who had even been wounded previously, he had just come back into the fighting, was then given around 25 men. And with him was his white officer, Captain Runyon. Basically, the skinny on this is, he's sent to go and attack the castle. As he's moving forward, the Germans notice him, and they open up on his little group of men. Some men start to go down, Captain Runyon and the rest, they all sort of run up and try and make their way up the hill. As they're making their way towards the castle and shooting and firing, Baker ends up pointing out a observation post, like a machine gun nest. He throws some grenades, shoots at it, kills 2 men. Unfortunately, a German grenade then falls in between himself and Runyon. It doesn't go off. But Runyon's had enough. He's done. So he says to Baker, I'm going to go back and get reinforcements. No, well, Baker, no, he's not coming back. That's it. So he leaves to go and get these reinforcements. By the way, they never show up. So that's just what happens. So Vernon pursues. He goes forward, right? He continues the operation with whatever men that he has left. But at this point, because the grenades have been going off, there's more Germans they're now on top of them. Many more are now dying around him, and he realizes at this point the attack can no longer go ahead. He now only has 8 men left. Keep that in mind. We're dealing with 25, we're now down to 8, right? At that point, he says, men, we have to turn back. Those soldiers don't want to go. They want to prove their worth, right? They enter the 92nd to fight, not to turn around. He says, guys, we can't do it. He leads down some cover and fire, throws some more grenades. 2 more men are wounded. He manages to get the rest of the 6 men off of the position in the castle back to a U.S. aid station, and that's where they recovered. 2 days later, after the failed attack at Angolfini, Baker volunteers for a night raid. And he goes in and he ends up doing it, right? Ends up surviving the war, ends up fighting in the Korean War as well, does his duty again, and of course it wasn't until 1997 that he ends up getting the Medal of Honor, right? Pretty crazy stuff when you're dealing with officers who are running away from the battle, losing lots of men left and right, still doing his American duty, and dealing with Jim Crow and racism. Can't even be properly awarded for it until many, many years later, right? So this is what gets me to my final thoughts here, and I think I've been hammering this home throughout my entire presentation, right? It is the idea of double victory. It is the fact that black soldiers consistently have been fighting since the American Revolution, right, as elements to achieve civil rights and the idea of humanity for themselves and for their people, right? The idea that going through military service, even when the nation does not want to see you as equal, they will make them see you as equal. I use this quote by Frederick Douglass here because I think it's just very, very important, right? That the liberties of the American people were not dependent upon the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. That without these, no class of people could live and flourish in this country. And I think that is very, very true, right? These men fought, these men died, and they bled when essentially America did not want them, nor did they care for them or their people. But they did so, and they persevered anyway. I think that's very, very powerful stuff. And I think it really does go to show you that for all the ideas of cowardice and bigotry and all the things that were thrown at these men, they stood above it all, and they achieved great things. And I think more importantly, they showed themselves to be the best and the pinnacle of what America has to offer. And I truly, truly hope that I share this story with you, that you will take this to understand that as Americans, we are all better served, right, as a nation of equals. Thank you very much. be taking some questions. Yes, sir.
What happened to the black soldiers in the Revolution who fought with the British?
Okay, so great question. So the soldiers that fought with the British in the American Revolution, many of them would end up joining, like I said, these what they call the Ethiopian regiments, or these black regiments. And after the war was over, many of them would serve in the Caribbean, and they would end up serving in what's known as the West Indies Regiment, which also kind of had a little bit of like prestige as well that sort of went along with it because of its service and time there. Not to say that their life as a soldier would have been easy, but they wouldn't have been involved in any heavy, real combat, even after the War of 1812. I think most notably, if I can remember correctly, and this is way after the American Revolution, West Indies regiments, you would see them somewhat in the First World War to some extent, but not necessarily fully. And then, of course, later on in World War II, Britain, of course, would also use its colonial regiments, right, to fight against the Nazis as well. But to answer your question, those that would end up going to fight for the British and afterwards, they would just end up being rehomed in the Caribbean. And that's really where they would end up staying. I think I know of some soldiers that went to Canada and then stayed there, and then at some point, those men, I think it was Nova Scotia, some of those men that were there and their families, they would be moved to Sierra Leone as part of like a British rehousing project that was going on during that time. Yes. Okay, yes.
So I was just to follow up on that. Unlike a lot of the loyalists who were Americans
Yes.
who went to England, returned to England after the Revolution.
Yes.
So that didn't happen with any of the black soldiers?
Not to my knowledge, but it is plausible. I do want to keep this in mind. When we think of England at the time of the American Revolution and during the 18th century, do think of London as somewhat as of a cosmopolitan city. Because of its vast colonial empire and the use of trade, there probably were black people who lived in England, and maybe some of them could have been some of these individuals who would have run away from slavery from America and ended up there as well. So it's entirely plausible that could have happened. But I personally don't have any information on that at this time. Yeah. But it probably exists, though. It does. Yeah.
I remember my history a little bit about Yorktown. Can you confirm? I think that at a certain point the British kicked out all the black people at Yorktown.
Oh, like had them like leave the city proper.
Yeah.
You know what?
Actually threw them. That was like throwing them to the
Dogs, right? Like yes.
throwing them to the Americans.
Yeah.
Because of food supply and all this
Right.
kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
Running out. All that. Yeah. I'm gonna have to look at that because I didn't know that myself. So that's something that I'm gonna look into.
Okay.
But I mean.
When they got surrounded and when they,
Yeah, they're running out of food and water, which is what happens in a siege situation. Which I'm not necessarily surprised by that. They would say, okay, listen, if you're an enslaved person or you're a free person, we just don't have this for you. You have to leave. So, yeah. Yes.
I remember reading that the Germans did learn a lot from the eugenics movement, and in fact, a book that was called Himmler's Bible was written, I think, by a guy who might have even been in Pasadena. And the Germans really admired the way Americans dealt with Indians and black people. And they thought that they were even too radical, because in all the anti-race laws that the Germans had, to be Jewish, you had to have one grandparent. But in American thought is if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you comment on that, or how aware were people fighting the war over there that the Germans had been really learning from the eugenicists and justifying the anti-race laws there.
Yeah, they're overall. I'm going to say, I think from the soldiers' perspective, I don't believe that they would have been made aware. Those types of things, I don't think would have necessarily been discussed, but I think if we're looking at black soldiers in general, and we take that further back to black people, right, when we look at and I'll go back to the Double Victory campaign, right, and when it starts, and that's around 1943, if I remember correctly, journalists who are writing about this make it very clear that they are aware of the German laws, right, that are happening to Jewish people, right? Because Hitler didn't mention it, right? He talked about it there. And so it's not that difficult, especially for journalists, to put two and two together and kind of see, oh my goodness, they're doing the same things or similar things that are going on over there are the same things that are happening here. And it's not lost on the soldiers either, because they would have been reading black newspapers and they would have been talking about all of these things together, right? So I think for them, they would have been aware of it, but I think to the extent of your question, it sounds more like you're asking about, you know, how much deep knowledge could they really see that connection between the two, right? I don't know if it would go that far, because that maybe is something, maybe a little more anachronistic, right? Something that scholars, I think, tend to look at. But I think if we're talking about the one-to-one between the everyman, right, so the every black soldier, I think if they were reading the newspaper and they knew what was going on in Germany, they would have said, yeah, no, I definitely see that. I see how that could be. In terms of who's aware of the camps and how all of that would work, that's a much later thing. That's very much the Americans are finding out as they enter Germany, right? The damage that has been done to the Jewish people as they enter Germany proper. And I think if you're a black soldier and you sort of see that, you also recognize how crazy that is, right? This extermination program that's been going on. And to some extent, you probably also see the parallels of what's going on as well. Right? Maybe your people weren't necessarily exterminated, but you certainly have great-grandparents or grandparents who were enslaved. And you probably have heard of the violence that went on there. So there's still that connection that could still be made. Now that is a lot of, you know, assumption here, right? We're sort of just kind of talking, I don't have the hard facts on it, but that's, you know, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but, you know, hopefully that answers your question, yeah. Yes?
Well, my father was a veteran of World War II, and one of the things that troubled him the most was when he was in the Philippines.
Oh, that's
And he did not see it firsthand, but he said 2 black American soldiers were hung by the American forces. And I don't know if have you ever run across anything, because I have tried to look up stuff on that, and I found nothing, of course.
I have not personally read anything about. I have so many questions now. I mean, you know, none of it seems justified at all. I can't even think of executions even happening to U.S. soldiers at this time in that way. Do I believe it? Yes, I do. So I think what your father saw was probably true.
He said it was, I think Tack Logan was the place that happened. He told me that.
I'm certainly going to want to look into that. Yeah, I haven't run across anything like that, but I don't see it not being possible. You know, we'll call it extrajudicial killings did happen in World War II, and they could happen to black troops even during the war itself. We do have to remember that just like in all wars, there is a fog of war, and part of that fog of war is that people do and can and will get away with anything. I do not know why these men would have been hung. I cannot imagine it's for anything very, very serious. I can't even begin to speculate what they could have done to have effectively been lynched in a time of war, which is even so gross, so incredibly gross. You know, we're all trying to fight Hitler and the rest, and they want to hang a peaceman. But very, very, very interesting. If I find out more, you know, maybe share some contact info. Maybe I can, you know, yeah, please.
Were there any black sailors in World War II?
Yes, many. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. The U.S. Navy had many black sailors, and in fact, let's talk maybe just a little bit about the Golden 13. They would be 13 first like African American like Navy officers, right? Like they were the top tier officers that were able to like sail the ships. Well, I say sail the ships. It was a program that was implemented very similar to kind of like Tuskegee. There was more of them, but eventually it dwindled down to 13 very exceptional men who would all end up running their own U.S. Navy ship. And that's pretty crazy because, again, segregated army, to a certain extent, the Navy wasn't segregated, but you weren't going to have captains giving orders, right, to white sailors, and these men could. Right? So they were there. So yeah, they were absolutely a part of it. Yeah. Okay. questions? No? Okay, all right.